The cabin of the first-class section buzzed quietly with the soft murmur of conversations and the clinking of glasses. Keanu Reeves sat by the window, dressed in a plain black hoodie and jeans. His demeanor was calm, almost too ordinary for someone of his stature. He was scrolling through his phone, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. Across the aisle, a man in a crisp suit glanced at him with a disdainful smirk. His name was Victor Langston, a well-known corporate executive who loved flaunting his wealth. Spotting Keanu's unassuming attire and lack of entourage, Victor couldn't resist making a snide comment. "First class isn't what it used to be," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. A few passengers turned their heads, sensing tension. Keanu remained silent, his eyes still on his phone, as if he hadn't heard. Victor, emboldened by the lack of response, leaned forward. "No offense, but it's surprising to see someone dressed like that here. First class is meant for people who've earned it." His tone dripped with condescension. A flight attendant approached, trying to diffuse the growing discomfort. "Sir, can I get you anything?" she asked Victor, her polite smile strained. Victor waved her off. "Just wondering if the airline's standards have dropped," he said, gesturing towards Keanu. "They're letting anyone in these days." Keanu finally looked up, his gaze steady but unreadable. "It's a nice seat," he said simply, his voice calm and kind. Victor chuckled derisively. "Yeah, well, some of us had to work hard for it. I'm guessing you got lucky." The tension in the cabin grew thick. A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. One woman muttered under her breath, "Doesn't he know who that is?" Keanu's lips curved into a faint smile, but he said nothing. The flight attendant returned, her face slightly flushed as she handed Keanu a drink. "Here you go, Mr. Reeves," she said, her tone more respectful this time. Victor froze, his smug expression faltering. "Wait, Reeves, as in Keanu Reeves." His voice wavered slightly, but he quickly masked it with a nervous laugh. "You're not the Keanu Reeves, are you?" Keanu raised an eyebrow, his smile widening ever so slightly. "The one and only," he said, his tone laced with subtle humor. Victor's face turned pale as whispers spread through the cabin. Passengers who had been quiet before now leaned in, murmuring in awe. One even pulled out their phone, discreetly snapping a photo. I didn't recognize you," Victor stammered, suddenly fidgeting with his tie. "I didn't mean to." Keanu held up a hand, cutting him off gently. "It's okay. People make mistakes," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of firmness. Victor's mouth opened to respond, but before he could say another word, a young boy from economy class appeared, clutching a worn paperback book. His eyes lit up when he saw Keanu. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said timidly, "are you really John Wick?" Keanu chuckled, his eyes softening. "Not right now, kid," he said, ruffling the boy's hair. "But maybe someday you'll see me in action again." The boy grinned, clutching the book to his chest. Victor watched the interaction, his face now a mix of embarrassment and regret. It was clear he had underestimated the man sitting quietly across from him. And Keanu, as always, carried himself with grace, because for him, kindness wasn't just a choice, it was a way of life. The tension in the cabin gradually eased as the passengers settled back into their seats, but Victor couldn't shake the weight of his own arrogance. He kept glancing at Keanu, his face a mixture of regret and unease. Keanu, on the other hand, seemed entirely unaffected, sipping his drink and gazing out the window as if the confrontation hadn't even occurred. Victor shifted in his seat, his mind racing. He wasn't the type to admit mistakes, especially not in front of an audience, but the guilt was gnawing at him. Still, he clung to his pride, trying to convince himself that it wasn't such a big deal. Minutes passed, and then the flight attendant returned with a tablet. "Mr. Reeves," she said softly, "would you like to review the charity proposals you requested before we land?" Victor's ears perked up. Charity proposals. He couldn't resist sneaking a peek at the tablet screen as she handed it to Keanu. His eyes widened when he saw the names of organizations: homeless shelters, orphanages, mental health initiatives. The sums listed next to them were staggering, far beyond what Victor could imagine donating in a lifetime. "Thank you," Keanu said warmly, scrolling through the list. He paused, tapping on one. "Let's increase the funding for this one. They're doing incredible work," and I think they need more support." Victor's throat tightened. He felt a wave of shame wash over him as he realized the vast difference between himself and the man he had insulted. While Victor's wealth was a tool for power and status, Keanu was using his for something far more meaningful. As the attendant walked away, Victor leaned forward hesitantly. I had no idea you were involved in things like that," he said, his voice quieter now, almost respectful. Keanu turned to him, his expression unreadable. "You didn't ask," he replied simply. Victor winced at the gentle rebuke. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a commotion erupted in the aisle. A middle-aged woman was clutching her chest, gasping for breath. Her face was pale, and panic spread through the cabin like wildfire. "Help! Is there a doctor on board?" someone shouted. Passengers scrambled, looking around, but no one stepped forward. The woman's husband was kneeling beside her, his hands trembling as he tried to keep her upright. "Please, someone help her," he cried. Without hesitation, Keanu stood up. He moved with a calm urgency, his presence commanding attention. "What happened?" he asked the husband, kneeling beside the woman. She has a heart condition," the man stammered. "I think it's her medication, but I don't know what to do." Keanu glanced at the flight attendant. "Get the emergency kit," he instructed, his voice steady. Then he turned back to the husband. "Does she have her pills with her?" The man fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a small bottle. Keanu examined it quickly, reading the label. "This is the right medication," he said, handing it to the husband. "Give her the dose, and I'll help her stay calm until we get her stabilized." Passengers watched in stunned silence as Keanu took charge, his calm demeanor diffusing the panic. Even Victor, who had remained frozen in his seat, couldn't help but feel a grudging admiration. After a tense few minutes, the woman's breathing steadied. The flight attendant returned with the kit, but by then, it was clear that Keanu's quick thinking had already made all the difference. As the woman was helped back to her seat, her husband turned to Keanu, tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "You saved her life." Keanu shook his head. "You did. You were there for her when she needed you most." The cabin erupted into quiet applause, and Keanu returned to his seat, brushing off the praise with his usual humility. Victor sat in stunned silence, his mind reeling. He had spent his life chasing wealth and status, believing that those were the measures of a man. But in that moment, he realized how wrong he had been. Victor looked at Keanu, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, I judged you without knowing anything about you." Keanu turned to him, his gaze steady. "It's not about me," he said softly. "It's about how we treat each other, especially when no one's watching." The words hit Victor like a punch to the gut, leaving him speechless as the flight continued in an almost reverent quiet. The plane began its descent, and the atmosphere in the cabin shifted to a more reflective calm. Victor sat silently, replaying the events of the flight in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt small, not because of someone else's success, but because of the shallowness of his own choices. Keanu, meanwhile, sat quietly, seemingly lost in thought. He didn't appear to hold any grudge against Victor, but his earlier words lingered in the air. Victor couldn't ignore them, no matter how much he tried. When the plane landed, passengers began gathering their belongings. Keanu stood, his movements unhurried as he helped an elderly woman retrieve her bag from the overhead compartment. She smiled gratefully, patting his arm. "Thank you, young man. You've been so kind." Victor, watching from his seat, felt an overwhelming need to do something, anything, to make things right. As the passengers shuffled off the plane, he hurried to catch up with Keanu. At the gate, Keanu paused, adjusting his backpack as he prepared to leave. Victor hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Mr. Reeves," he began, his voice shaky. Keanu turned, his expression neutral but patient. Victor extended a hand, though his own trembled slightly. "I wanted to thank you," he said, struggling to find the right words. "Not just for what you did on the flight, but for reminding me of what really matters." Keanu looked at the outstretched hand for a moment before shaking it firmly. Keanu looked at the outstretched hand for a moment before shaking it firmly. "It's not about thanks," he said quietly, his voice calm yet piercing. "It's about learning to see people for who they are, not who you think they should be." Victor nodded, his face flushing with a mix of shame and gratitude. "You're right," he admitted. "I've spent my whole life focused on appearances, wealth, and status. But today, you showed me that real worth comes from how we treat others." Keanu gave him a small, understanding smile. "It's never too late to start over," he said. "Just remember, the way you live your life isn't about the mistakes you've made, it's about what you do next." The words lingered in Victor's mind as Keanu turned and walked toward the terminal exit. Victor stood there for a moment, watching him leave, his thoughts racing. As he moved toward baggage claim, Victor noticed the young boy from earlier sitting with his mother, clutching the worn paperback book. The boy's eyes lit up when he saw Victor approach. "Did you get to talk to him?" the boy asked, his voice brimming with excitement. Victor hesitated, then crouched down to the boy's level. "I did," he said with a small smile. "And he taught me something very important." "What's that?" the boy asked curiously. Victor glanced at the boy's mother, who was watching the interaction with quiet interest. He looked back at the boy and said, "That it's never too late to be better. And that kindness is the most valuable thing you can give someone." The boy grinned, holding up his book. "That's what I thought too. He's just like the heroes in the stories." Victor stood, his chest feeling lighter than it had in years. For the first time in a long while, he felt inspired, not by wealth or power, but by the idea that he could start making a difference. As Victor walked toward the parking lot, he noticed Keanu standing by a black car, signing autographs for a small group of fans who had recognized him. Keanu caught Victor's eye briefly, giving him a small nod of acknowledgement before climbing into the car and driving away. Victor stood there for a moment, taking in the lesson he'd learned. Today wasn't just about being humbled, it was about seeing the world, and himself, through a new lens. With a deep breath, he resolved to live differently, knowing that the real journey was only just beginning. Victor walked out of the airport, feeling the cool breeze on his face as if it carried the weight of change. For years, he had chased the illusion of success, measuring his worth by titles, wealth, and recognition. But in just a few hours, Keanu Reeves, through his quiet humility and unwavering kindness, had dismantled everything Victor thought he knew about greatness. He pulled out his phone, scrolling past emails and notifications until he landed on a contact, the head of his company's philanthropy division. His finger hovered for a moment before pressing call. "Janet," he said when the line connected. "I want to increase our community funding. Double it, no, triple it, and find me a local school or shelter we can support directly. I want to meet the people we're helping." Janet was silent for a moment, stunned. "Of course, Mr. Langston. I'll arrange everything." Victor hung up, a small smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't just about fixing his mistakes anymore, it was about creating something meaningful. As he drove away from the airport, he couldn't help but think of Keanu's words, "It's never too late to start over." For the first time in his life, Victor felt at peace. Not because he had everything, but because he had finally understood what it meant to truly have something. And as he glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror, he realized he was no longer the man who had boarded that plane. He was someone better.